Good morning. June 1st, 2022. I'd like to call to order the COGCC regular meeting for today. Chairman Robbins is out of the office today, so I have the unfortunate role of being chair for this meeting. But welcome everyone. I think first order of business is a roll call of commissioners.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins. Mr. Chair, you have 4 out of 7 commissioners present.
Thank you very much. First thing on the agenda is commissioner comments. Do commissioners have any comments that they wish to share this morning? Seeing none, we will move then on to director comments. Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I have a fairly brief update. Governor Polis has sent a letter to Executive Director Dan Gibbs, Chair Jeff Robbins, and myself about continuing to pursue carbon capture, utilization, and storage principles. And first of all, I'm extremely excited about the opportunity. We're putting together a team of folks right now to help convene stakeholder conversations. And I think really the tenor of the letter is to work with key stakeholders to prepare legislative regulatory proposals to address primacy for Class 6 wells, which are the carbon sequestration wells currently permitted by EPA in Colorado, and addressing other related issues that are prerequisites to seeking primacy, and kind of working through a number of those different components. I think that this is a wonderful opportunity for COGCC to capitalize on its existing expertise in a different space or a slightly different space, and continue to evaluate what other opportunities there are in Colorado as a tool for reducing and removing pollution, to quote the letter specifically. So I'm very excited about it. We will have that letter posted and out, available for folks if they want to take a look at it. But know that this summer we will start having conversations, and they'll probably pick up in intensity through the fall. And that is the sum total of my announcement. Chair, I would note that I have to pop out for a doctor's meeting in about half an hour. A doctor's appointment. My brain is 100% fried. And I would also note that this will be my last commission hearing until I return from parental leave. So I will be kind of popping in and out this morning, but it's been just a wonderful opportunity to work with all of you, and I can't wait to come back this fall and pick it back up and see where we're going. And with that, I will.
Dr. Murphy, there is no question that you will be incredibly missed while you're away, but wish you nothing but the best over the next few months as you get the great opportunity to spend time with your family. Commissioners, do you have any questions for Director Murphy regarding the letter, or does anyone have anything else to add? All right. Well, thank you. Super exciting announcement, and appreciate you sharing it with us. I think next up, prior to consent agenda, is we have one public commenter. City of Broomfield would like to share some information on a survey that they have done. Ms. Larson, if we want to bring up, I can't remember who we're bringing up from the City of Broomfield, and we'll give them 5 minutes, and then if commissioners have any questions, well, we can ask them.
Yes, thank you. It's Dr. Megan Weisner, and she is coming in right now as a panelist.
All right, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you and see you.
Great. Good morning, commissioners, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. My name is Dr. Megan Weisner. I'm the Senior Environmental Epidemiologist for the City and County of Broomfield. Over the past year, the City and County of Broomfield Department of Public Health has partnered with a team of researchers at the Colorado School of Public Health at the University of Colorado Denver Anschutz campus to better understand the health implications of living near oil and gas development in Broomfield. So from October through December of 2021, we collected health data from over 400 randomly identified households living throughout Broomfield. During the time we collected health data, there were several large-scale oil and gas operations occurring at multiple pads that were in pre-production phases, such as drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and coiled tubing mill out. We also had some pads that were in production at this time. So the objective of our study was to understand if randomly sampled residents living within 1 mile of these large-scale oil and gas operations in Broomfield reported a higher frequency of symptoms than residents living at distances greater than 2 miles away. This epidemiological investigation had limitations, as all studies do, and we cannot define causation of the symptoms reported. There is always the potential for subjectivity and bias when it comes to self-reported data. I want to acknowledge that. However, we used well-established methodologies, had a statistically significant sample size, and we adjusted for numerous confounding variables within our data set. Overall, our results found that those living within 1 mile of an unconventional oil and gas site in Broomfield reported significantly greater frequencies of upper respiratory and acute symptoms, such as nosebleeds, lung irritation, and shortness of breath, than respondents living more than 2 miles away from these sites. Additionally, respondents living within 2 miles of an unconventional oil and gas site also reported that their children experienced significantly greater frequencies of lower respiratory, gastrointestinal, and acute response symptoms than those living greater than 2 miles from the sites. Lastly, among all respondents, regardless of distance from oil and gas, level of concern about odor, noise, and air impacted the frequency of the symptoms reported. Possible explanations for the increase in symptoms reported near these multi-well horizontal oil and gas sites include exposure to volatile organic compounds associated with pre-production oil and gas activities. During the time survey data was collected, Broomfield's air quality monitoring program documented a considerable increase in the frequency and duration of VOC release events related to oil and gas pre-production operations. And some of these plumes are recorded to have traveled a mile into a nearby neighborhood. The research is the first of its type to observe increases in nosebleeds, nausea, vomiting, and shortness of breath symptoms. Now, a lot of previous other studies have been conducted that evaluated exposure proximity to unconventional natural gas well sites. A lot of those studies were different as they included single well sites, and we did not. A lot of the other studies in the health literature were around heavy natural gas extraction areas, such as those in Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale region. Our study evaluated symptoms and proximity to large multi-well unconventional oil and natural gas sites. And in Colorado, here in Broomfield specifically, we have a much higher level of oil extraction than other studies that are in the epidemiological literature around oil and gas. This research indicates that living within 1 mile of a large multi-well site, which includes oil extraction, could potentially increase cumulative impacts from exposure to air pollutants from multiple oil and gas pads. The findings from this study have broad implications, and the City and County of Broomfield will be using the findings from this study when commenting on oil and gas development projects in adjacent jurisdictions. Thank you so much for your time and attention to this important matter.
Thank you, Dr. Weisner. Commissioners, do you have any questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for sharing this today. I saw the study when it was released, the survey, and I found it very interesting and obviously maybe could be useful for kind of broad brushstrokes related to health impacts. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I have a lot of questions, and so this might be better for maybe a study session with the commissioners or a one-on-one. But I'm wondering if you could explain kind of the difference between a study versus a survey, because this felt a little more like a survey to me than a study. And maybe I'm misunderstanding kind of the differentiation between the two. So I'll start with that question if you wouldn't mind responding to that.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. So this was a epidemiological study. We went through the University of Colorado's Institutional Review Board. So this study had to pass a very rigorous review in the sense that it's ethical, it's robust, we're using valid statistical methodologies and so forth. So a survey you can send out to anybody, but a peer-reviewed journal is not going to publish that unless you go through the proper channels of having an institutional review board look through it and approve it. And that's what we did. So we are very hopeful that this study will be published in a scientific journal in the very near future. We don't have control over that, but we have set everything up so that we can do so. And that's sort of the difference between a study and, just like a survey that was done.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could you explain how the study took into account, and I think I read in your study that you did account for this, but I'm not sure how, other things that could influence health outcomes, like if you live near a highway or if there's another industrial activity occurring in a similar area where the oil and gas activity might be taking place.
Sure. So we adjusted for, first of all, I'll say we adjusted for about 10 different confounding health variables like age, race, sex, number of pre-existing health conditions somebody has, and so forth. So we adjusted for all these things, which says, let's assume the population health is the same based on all of these variables. So we don't have these big influencers for like age. So we adjusted for that, which was great because we asked people about all of these different health variables and they were able to respond to that. As far as other environmental exposures, we have the most robust air quality monitoring program, I believe, in the state. I think a lot of people are aware of it. And when we see pollution sources measured on our air quality monitoring system that don't look like they're influenced by downhole oil and gas operations, we take a deep look at those. So we really don't see a lot of pollution coming from the highway that has signatures of traffic and combustion. We see a lot of our plumes have that raw hydrocarbon signature that's really characteristic of downhole operations. And if our air quality monitoring were picking up significant sources near the highway, we would have certainly addressed for that. But we've got monitors all over Broomfield and close to the highway, and we just don't see that. So the study objective was to look at proximity to oil and gas, not necessarily proximity to highways. So we didn't control for it, but our air quality monitoring system didn't give us any reason to suspect that we were picking up pollution from other sources other than oil and gas.
Thank you. I'm wondering, could you talk again about, I think you said that you looked at the results from folks who were near maybe just one pad versus multiple sites. And was there a differentiation in the survey responses?
So I think what you're asking is, so let me just say, we have 6 multi-well operations in Broomfield, 6 large horizontal sites. And we didn't look at, responses close to those old vertical wells that we have scattered throughout the state and Broomfield. We have never really received health complaints in association with small vertical wells at Broomfield. So that wasn't the objective of the study. It was really these large scale pads. So what we did was we took those 6 pads that have those multiple wells on them, and we drew a distance ring around it, 1 mile. So it was kind of like this really crazy shaped, perimeter that you could see that's a 1 mile distance from those 6 pads. And then we took all the households within a 1 mile radius of those 6 pads. And we compared their symptoms to those living greater than 2 miles away. And that's where we saw a significant difference in the frequency of symptoms that were being reported. And the reason we chose a 1 mile distance is because our air quality monitoring shows plumes coming from the pad with clear oil and gas hydrocarbon signatures. And then we've often picked them up in a neighborhood 1 mile away, less concentrated, of course, but still the same sort of plume. And our air scientists from Colorado State University have helped us characterize and really understand how those plumes sort of travel and make their way into neighborhoods.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Are you all going to do another survey post? So from understanding, during the survey, there was some pre-production going on, which is drilling, things that create noise or odor or other maybe potential of health effects, right? And are you going to do another survey when all that is done and now they're just in the production phase to see if there is a difference and if these are short-term health effects versus long-term? I guess I need to say perceived because it's a survey and it's self-reporting.
I would love to compare that pre-production phase, which we know we have more emissions related to pre-production than production. You know, we have some very strict BMPs in Broomfield. We have closed loop flow back. So we do not see the same level of emissions when we move into production in Broomfield as we've seen with some of our previous pads, like the Livingston pad, since we've been monitoring there for a couple of years. I would love to do another survey, and however, it comes down to funding. And you know, how much can Broomfield shoulder continuous studies? I mean, I think we'll try our absolute hardest, but we would need to look elsewhere for some financial assistance on future studies.
Thank you. And then my last kind of question is, I want to just clarify. I think that this kind of a study, if I'm understanding it, it really cannot show causation. It potentially can show correlation, and those are different things.
You're absolutely right. So an epidemiological study cannot show causation. So what we're saying here is we are seeing a correlation between living through our statistical analysis. We did ordinary least squares regression analysis, and we're seeing this correlation and association with living within that 1 mile distance ring and having a greater frequency of symptoms than if we live 2 miles away. But we can't say the cause. We cannot say the cause is oil and gas. However, we do have to remain vigilant that you know, there is an abundance of literature that is pointing to the same thing. And we do have measurements from our air quality monitoring system. We captured over 50 different plumes within 3 months during pre-production. We had a 1 hour benzene estimate over 200 ppb. We saw plumes lasted on average for 3.5 hours. And so we do have some data that points in the direction that oil and gas exposure could be causing this increase in symptoms. However, you're right, we cannot say that that is the cause. Absolutely, we're not able to determine that from this type of study.
Thank you. And so I know I said last question, but I have one more. I'm curious to know if I think I understood what you said earlier was that for children living up to 2 miles away, there were still health impacts, but for adults closer to within 1 mile. And I'm wondering why there would be more health impacts 2 miles away versus 1. Did I understand what you said correctly?
Yeah, and you did. And that's a really great question. So we had 427 adults respond to the survey, which is a very significant sample size. But the children, we didn't have as big of a, sample size. So not all parents wanted to answer for a child, or they don't have children. So we had responses for 59 children. We couldn't break them into 3 distance categories, 1 mile, 1 to 2, and greater than 2, because the analysis, it was too small. So we had to look at children within 2 miles and then compare that to children living greater than 2 miles. And we didn't expect that we would see much of a difference, but we did. And I think one of the surprising things was gastrointestinal symptoms like nausea and vomiting were reported at a greater frequency within a 2 mile distance band for children. And we know children's bodies are more sensitive, so it is reasonable to break it into those 2 distance bands. However, I want to say the main analysis and the main takeaway from the study was for these 427 adults. But I think this study points to the fact that maybe we need a little bit more research that's focused on children living near these sites.
Thank you. I appreciate your patience with me and answering my questions.
Of course, happy to always meet offline or discuss this as the COGCC would wish. I'm more than happy to do that.
Other commissioners with questions? I've got one. Dr. Weisner, I think you had indicated that the intent was to get this survey study peer reviewed and published. And what kind of timeline does that usually look like?
That's a great question. So the best answer I can give you is publishing in a peer-reviewed journal can take a year, it can take longer, or it can be expedited and take 90 days. So we're submitting the manuscript this month in June to a peer-reviewed journal, and it's sort of it's really up to the peer reviewers' timeline and discretion. And then, of course, do they want to put it in the upcoming edition, or do they want to wait? There's a lot of other things that go into this. We're very confident that it will be published, but the timeline's really hard to say it as to when that will happen. And of course, we will share the published manuscript out whenever that does occur.
Great. I mean, I think as one commissioner, I would be super interested in having a more depth conversation about this once it's gone through that peer review and published process, which is one of the expectations, at least as me as a commissioner, it has, as far as taking studies into consideration in further depth at the COGCC. So I appreciate you being here today and sharing that information with us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And Commissioner Messner, thank you for wanting this to be in a peer-reviewed journal. We also want that to carry that weight where it's published in a scientific journal. So thank you for paying attention to studies such as this, and happy to connect as you guys wish. So thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, commissioners, I think the next item on our agenda is consent agenda. Does anyone have questions about the consent agenda? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm good with the consent agenda. I'm just wondering if we could ask staff to kind of take a peek under the hood with Paradox. They have a payment of proceeds issue on the consent agenda. And sometimes we've been told through kind of many of our hearings that can be a red flag for something going on. It might not be. Just wondering if commission staff would be willing to kind of take a look at what's going on with Paradox and report back to the commission at a future date.
Director Murphy?
Commissioner, I'm happy to say yes, we will, especially since it won't be me, right? No, I'm kidding. I think we'll make sure that happens. And I saw Mimi pop up, and I'll flag the issue for Mimi and Scott for a go forward presentation.
Great, I think that's a good idea as well. Any other questions about the consent agenda? I'd entertain a motion on the consent agenda.
I move to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we have a motion to approve and a second. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Is there any opposed? The consent agenda is approved. Next up, we have docket number 22010001. This is a variance request. I think Ms. Fulcher is here. Is there others that need to join you?
Good morning, commissioners. Yes, let me just check here. We need Nicole Blevins, Mike Mercer, and Michael Wiley to be promoted to panelists as well. Ms. Larson, if you see them in attendance. And while we're working on that, I will start with a share screen here, if you just give us a moment.
And Ms. Fulcher, forgive me, it was Mr. Mercer, and the other individual was?
Mike Wiley or
Mike.
Michael Wiley.
And just so folks know, this is a variance request. We'll have an applicant presentation. Afterwards, commissioners, staff will be, the applicant and staff will be available for questions that we may have prior to deliberations.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, good morning, commissioners. Thank you so much for the time and good to be with you this morning. Jill Fulcher, attorney at Beatty and Wozniak, here today on behalf of Chevron USA and Scout Energy Management, who are co-applicants in this case. We've got a slide deck before you. I believe you've got it in your portfolio, and we are going to do our best to get through this in about 15 minutes, but we may just be a couple minutes beyond that 15-minute marker if you could bear with us, but we're going to try to keep this brief. And I'm going to kick us off with just the first couple slides and then kick it over to our subject matter experts that I will introduce a little bit more thoroughly in a moment. But we've got Mike Mercer with us and Michael Wiley. Also with me today is Nicole Blevins, my colleague, and she may be answering some questions as well. So again, this is a variance application presented by both Chevron and Scout as co-applicants, and that's a little bit unique. You don't normally see that. It pertains to an asset in the Rangeley Weber Sand Unit, which is near the town of Rangeley, Colorado, out in Rio Blanco County. And you're going to hear testimony that this unit has been operated by Chevron for almost 90 years. And yes, you heard me right, 90, and was recently transferred to Scout. And now Scout is the owner and operator of the asset. Scout's transfer of operatorship subsequent to Form 9 is still in process. I believe it's nearing final review, but because of that, Chevron is still listed as the operator of the asset, even though Scout is now the owner. So that's why we've got two applicants for you today supporting this variance. This variance pertains to Rule 612. Rule 612 in your rule book pertains to operations involving hydrogen sulfide gas, or H2S. And specifically, this variance request deals with two subsets, discrete subsets of that rule, Rule 612E 1 through 4 and 612F4. And as your materials note, with respect to 612E 1 through 4, and really I want to focus in on 2 through 4, that's a new rule requirement that would require all designated H2S well locations to have fencing, fixed alarms, and wind indicators within those locations. That's a new rule requirement. Well, in this particular area, and you're going to see a map to this effect here in a moment, that would be about 800 of the wells in this unit that would require that permanent retrofitting. And you're going to see that the majority of this unit, is about 95% of it, is in an extremely remote area of Rio Blanco County. It's mostly BLM land, or about 50-50, but it's all isolated desert land. So there's not public receptors or building units near those wells. So there's already existing substantial, significant existing protocols, safety protocols in place. But in particular, we believe that these additional requirements would not only create a very significant burden to Scout, but would do so without any measurable benefit. It would be redundant to what's already existing in the field, given that there's no public that's nearby these wells. These wells in particular, unlike other wells that you're used to seeing or other facility designs, these are just sealed wellheads out there in these remote areas. And you're going to hear testimony to that effect as well. So there's no separation equipment or tanks on the site. So there would be no expectation of H2S in the headspace on these wellheads, which is also significant because it drives down that risk. You're going to notice on the map that the town of Rangeley is in the southeast portion of this unit. And in that particular area, there are a few wells and some facilities. And in that instance, there are wind indicators and alarms and fencing, because those would be near to public receptors. So Scout's existing public protection plan that's been voluntarily implemented would already call for those safety measures where there would be potentially public in the field. There's also an issue with 612F4. So now under that particular provision, operators are required to do monthly gas analysis and testing at each designated H2S location. So again, now under this rule, that would be about 800 locations. And in this unit, that would require monthly testing. So you're going to hear testimony that we actually believe that would create a safety risk where there isn't one. Again, these are sealed wellheads, so we don't expect H2S to be present. And in order to test that gas monthly, it would actually require Scout to open up the wellhead to atmosphere and potentially expose the atmosphere to H2S 800 times a month, about 10,000 times a year. We don't think that that is a safety risk worth taking to Scout's personnel and to the public. And that's particularly true. You're going to hear testimony from Mr. Mercer, because the H2S profile in this area is extremely well known. Again, H2S has been present in this field for decades, and as a result, there's already heightened measures involving safety protocols and gas analysis, and that includes monthly testing at the gas plant, which is the commingling point for all of the gas in the field and representative of the gas in the field. So we're proposing, if you approve this variance today, that the gas continue to be tested monthly at the gas plant, which again is representative of the gas in the field. And you're going to hear testimony that the concentrations there have been very stable for many, many years. In addition to posing a safety risk, there's not lab feasibility for that type of testing. That's basically continuous testing at all times, doing 800 lab tests a month for 800 wells each month. So you're going to hear Mr. Mercer speak to the limited lab resources that are available to even conduct that type of testing. So those are the discrete subsets of rules. Couple of other things. This application, as you know, is uncontested. It was noticed to hundreds of interested parties, which would include all the surface owners in this area, Town of Rangeley, Rio Blanco County, BLM, CPW, and CDPHE. So it's gone through a robust notice process and no objections were received and no comments were even filed in concern of this application. Also, we have engineering staff that is supporting this application. I believe that this application has undergone significant staff review, and at least with respect to engineering staff, who I believe is in regular communication with Chevron and now Scout regarding these operations, they've indicated support as part of that analysis. I'm going to skip over this slide because I've already identified to you the rules that are at issue as part of this variance. I would just note BLM onshore order number 6 is also baked into your rule 612, and operators are required to abide by this onshore order for H2S operations, and Scout is in full compliance with this order. And the public protection plan that's in place for this operation, it's not required by your rules or by the onshore order, but it was voluntarily implemented by Chevron and now Scout. And again, the operators are in compliance with that PPP. Again, this application meets with all procedural and substantive requirements. Your record has substantial evidence that approval of this application is in accordance with 502, will not violate the intent of the Oil and Gas Act, and is necessary. And also, not only has this application been noticed, but I do want to mention that it has been published in the local newspapers as well. So with that, our witnesses, we've got Mr. Michael Wiley, who's the senior foreman for Scout Energy Management. And previous to that role, he was actually the Rangeley plant operations supervisor for Chevron. So Mr. Wiley has actually operated in this unit for over 20 years. So he brings substantial institutional knowledge about how operations work in this field and about the public protection plan that's in place. So you'll hear from him, and then you'll hear from Mike Mercer, who is the vice president of operations for Scout Energy Management. And he'll speak a little bit more to the reasons for the variance and why it's necessary and Scout's operational plans. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Mr. Wiley, and I will continue to direct the slides. So Mr. Wiley, feel free to just cue me whenever you're ready for me to move from one to the next.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and thank you, commissioners, for listening to us today. So yeah, the Rangeley Weber Sand Unit, the BLM formed the unitization of it in 1957. That same year, Chevron was selected as the unit operator. So in December, or on December 1st, Chevron transferred their ownership to Scout Energy. Jill, next. So a little bit of an overview of Rangeley Weber Sand Unit. It's really remote. The town of Rangeley is about 2,200 people. Approximately half of the unit is BLM. The unit's comprised of about 20,000 acres. It's 10 miles wide by 5 miles north to south. It's really contains stable amounts and known amounts of H2S through years and decades of testing H2S. Currently, Scout's employing and has contractors. About 77 employees and contractors live and work in Rangeley and their families, including myself. So we're genuinely concerned and want to keep everybody safe every day. So next. Yeah, as you can see on the slide, the map for reference, as Jill pointed out, the town of Rangeley is located in the southwest or southeastern corner. There are a few wells along the boundaries of town and near town. We do have increased safeguards, including the fencing. We have some windsocks. We have H2S detection, both audio and visual, around those locations. The vast majority of the field, the 95%, I would say, of those 800 wells is very remote, desert, long tenured in Rangeley. You can see the remoteness just from the map itself. The gas plant's kind of centrally located in the field. We have a couple water plants as well. I'll go over that brief process flow diagram of how the field works in just a second. Next. So yeah, here's the block flow diagram of how Rangeley Weber sand unit's working. So we're starting out with our producing wells. From our production wells, which are carrying both gas, water, and oil, it'll go to, the fluids are directed to one of 27 collection stations. At those collection stations, we're separating the oil and water, sending that to the water plants, which we have 2 of. The gas is then going to our CO2 reinjection facility. From our CO2 reinjection facility, we are recompressing the CO2. We're extracting a small amount of NGL, and then we're reinjecting that CO2 back into the field for tertiary recovery. At the water plants, we're separating both oil and water. That water is then getting reinjected back into the field for tertiary recovery as well. The oil is getting sold to Chevron Pipeline and Power. Next. Here's an example of the typical well in Rangeley. So, like I was saying, we have about 800 wells, slightly over. They're all sealed wells. We have safeties on the wells. We have low pressure shutdowns, high pressure shutdowns. It's a sealed wellhead. We do not have tanks. We do not have methods of separation on the location itself. They're all directed to a flow line and then to the collection stations. So very typical, very little risk. We're using NACE standards for our material selection. So go ahead and Jill, next. Here's an example of one of our 27 collection stations. So this is collection station 47. It is near the town of Rangeley. As you can see, it's fenced. We do the 2-phase separation here as well. We have windsocks, we have H2S signage, we have H2S audio visual detection. We do have a tank on this. These are closed systems where we're not venting or any gas is not escaping. There is a tank on site for emergency use only, which is very, very seldomly used. Next, Jill. Here's an example of the water plants. We have 2 water facilities. At each facility, we have a series of tanks where we're just aiding in the separation of oil and water. All of these tanks have vapor recovery units. Again, we're not venting any gas. These also have H2S audio-visual detection, windsocks. Next, Jill. Here's an example of the CO2 and NGL reinjection facility. So this facility, it's a PSM regulated facility. There's 14 H2S detection monitors throughout the facility, multiple windsocks. It is fenced. We're taking monthly gas samples at several points throughout this process. The quantity of H2S has been very, very stable. For the last 3 years, it hasn't moved much at all. So next. So our current unit operation, we're really just status quo. Scout is operating just as Chevron had in the previous years. We do have 2 workover rigs operating, which is what Chevron was operating prior to the handover of operations. Both of those workover rigs have H2S audio visual that they pull or that they carry with them to well site, also signage, windsocks while the operations are occurring. Next. Additionally, we use a Scada system. We monitor points throughout the field, all of our production lines, all of our injection lines. We're monitoring pressures for any kind of loss of containment. We have 24/7 coverage. We have night personnel on site. We're visiting these well sites multiple times a day. We have our fixed H2S monitors and our personal monitors. All of our employees are required to wear H2S personal monitors. The fixed monitors are calibrated quarterly or monthly, depending on location. The personal monitors are bump tested regularly by our employees. Our employees are also trained in the H2S and the hazards annually. All of our locations additionally have warning signs saying, warning about the presence or the potential of H2S on location. Next. So really the key points were the gas plant, all of the CO2 in the Rangeley field is going to the gas plant. We are monitoring multiple points on a monthly basis. The H2S concentrations are known and stable and have been for decades. In my tenure, I've been in Rangeley and worked Rangeley for over 20 years. I've never been around or never known of a reportable incident dealing with H2S. The majority of the field is very remote, isolated with no public receptors. The wells are sealed. There's no tanks or separation equipment on location. Next. Like Jill had said, the public protection plan, the overview, I'm not going to really go through this. It's really not required, considering our radius of exposure that we've assessed on all our wells and facilities. It's something we're proactively doing to help keep the public and our people safe. Next. So the public protection plan was developed by Chevron in 2017. All of the wells were sampled for H2S on an annual basis. It has been approved by both the BLM and the COGCC staff. It is reviewed annually by both Chevron and Scout Energy now. And the monthly samples at the gas plant, the CO2 reinjection facility are taken monthly. Next. So we have our safeguards in the field. We have warning locations or warning signs at all of our locations. We have windsocks at all of our collection stations, and then located throughout the whole field. All the facilities have windsocks. We have audio-visual locations of H2S alarms and facility near public receptors. The fencing around all the public receptors, the locations with public receptors, our field personnel is required to wear the H2S personal monitors. Next. Really some of the key points of the public protection plan. It has been approved by both BLM, COGCC. It applies to the whole unit, including all 800 wells, all the facilities. It's been proven to be effective at protecting our public and the employees. And there haven't been any H2S safety incidents in the last 20 plus years in my tenure, at least, that I can vouch for. Next. And with that, I'll pass it on to Mike Mercer. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Mercer. Thank you for allowing us to present today. Am I coming through clear? Okay, so I'm the Vice President of Operations for Scout Energy. I currently oversee operations in 4 states with about 10,000 wells under my management, and I have 23 years of operational experience. As I'm sure you are aware, in January of 2020, a rule change occurred that designated H2S locations as applicable to individual wells. And this rule requires warning signs, monitors, windsocks, fencing, and monthly gas testing. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with a discussion about the monthly testing. The monthly testing at Rangeley would be an onerous task. You know, as Mr. Wiley has explained, our field is remote. We have approximately 800 wells, which are sealed with no equipment on location. Additionally, we know we have H2S and we monitor it monthly. Additional monitoring won't tell us much more than what we already know. However, additional testing would actually increase the risk of exposure. As Mrs. Fulcher mentioned, with opening these wells up monthly, it equates to almost 10,000 potential exposures per year for our personnel and the public. We're regularly monitoring H2S at the plant every month. The lift of 800 lab tests per month, we don't have a testing facility nearby that can handle that. And then besides that, just having people out there gathering 800 samples per well, we think would have a negative effect on the environment due to increased truck traffic, related emissions and noise. Next slide, please. As for the other safeguards, the fixed monitors, windsocks and fencing, we believe they're unnecessary, as Mr. Wiley stated. Remote location, it's been in operation for over 80 years, 65 years since unitization. The monitors, windsocks, and fencing at hundreds of sealed wells adds no benefit and creates an undue burden on Scout as the operator. I will say that we are safety focused. Everyone at Scouts wants every single one of our coworkers to go home safely every night, and that applies to the public as well. Under the PPP, personal monitors are required on location, and we have additional safeguards in place for workover operations. As Mr. Wiley mentioned, the monitors and windsocks and additional signage. Under the PPP and pursuant to onshore order 6, we have audio visual alarms, fencing and wind indicators on all locations near the public. We have operators checking these wells daily, and we have personnel in the field 24/7. Fencing is unnecessary due to the remote nature, but could pose a safety issue for our personnel, requiring them to get out of and back into their vehicles on entry and exit of each location. Although this may sound trivial, remember we're accessing these locations at all hours of the day and night and in all kinds of weather. Lastly, we do have signs at all locations indicating the potential presence of H2S. And these unnecessary additional measures would be a significant financial burden to Scout. Next slide, please. So as I hope I've clearly outlined with Mr. Wiley's help, that these requirements will cause undue burdens to Scout for no benefit. In an attempt to keep everyone safe by keeping sealed wells sealed and removing the need to open wells up 9,600 times per year, Scada is seeking to designate the entire unit as an H2S location. Additionally, we request continued use of the CO2 NGL plant as our proxy location that's representative of the entire unit, where we will continue to do monthly H2S testing. Next slide, please. Scada is also requesting variance to Rule 612E at individual locations because there is no additional benefit. We will continue to operate pursuant to onshore order 6 and the PPP. We will continue to require personal monitors for all personnel, windsocks during workover operations, and fencing for locations near the public and receptors. Lastly, we will continue to maintain signage on all locations indicating the possible presence of H2S. Scada has been and will continue operating the unit pursuant to the PPP and consistent with Chevron's past operations. We have no new wells planned, nor do we anticipate doing anything in our operations that would change H2S concentrations. We do anticipate continuing to operate 2 workover rigs for the foreseeable future. That concludes my comments. Thank you for your time, and I will now pass it back to Mrs. Fulcher for a wrap up.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you again, commissioners. I'm not going to belabor this slide. You've heard this several times over this morning. I just want to remind you that we're sitting here today with an uncontested application that's garnered support from engineering staff. Again, this has been noticed to hundreds of parties, and there's been outreach with the town of Rangeley with respect to this variance. And I guess just in sum, Chevron is asking just to continue to operate this field as it has been doing now for decades. So we're not asking for anything to change. We're asking for operations to continue on as they have safely now for a demonstrable period. So with that, we're here to answer questions and appreciate your time again this morning.
Thank you all for the presentation. Commissioners, are there questions for the applicant and or staff? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation today. It was informative, and I've read through the materials and listened to the presentation, including the PowerPoint. and there were a couple things that just kind of didn't I guess connect for me. I'm curious because I thought I heard in the presentation that there's signage at every location, and I understand that to mean signage at every wellhead in Rangeley. I see you guys nodding. Is that correct? Okay, so then do we need a variance for 612E1? Right, is kind of my first question, and then I'm gonna ramble here for a little bit. The next one is monitoring. I heard monitoring at every location. Is that, did I hear that correctly as well? Okay, so not monitoring at every location. Mr. Wiley, Mr. Mercer, I heard you, I saw you shaking your head. Can you tell me a little bit more about the monitoring throughout the field and what that looks like under, I guess, its current existence? If you don't have monitors at every location, where are the monitors and how are they set up?
I can. So to touch base on the 612E1, the signs, we do have signs at every location. Because of the way the lease roads work, the 200 feet to 500 feet kind of window that they have to be in, there are probably some that are closer than 200 feet from the wellhead. So just the way that the roads work out there, it becomes impractical. You'd be putting a sign 150 feet up a road and 150 feet down the other road because the well is only 50 feet off the main road, if that kind of makes sense. But there is signage out there everywhere that says possible H2S presence. As for testing, right now we are testing at the plant. We've got about 10 points in the plant that we're testing monthly for. In 2017, kind of with the creation of the PPP, testing was performed at every single well, and it showed to be consistent kind of throughout the field, but as we've described, all those individual wells, although there is some variability, they all come into common lines, get to the collection station, and ultimately end up back at the plant completely commingled. So that's why we've used the plant as a commingled source or point source to do all of our testing.
Thank you, Mr. Mercer. And I get that part for the testing of the actual substance itself. And I guess what I was asking is about the H2S monitoring with the audio and visual alarms. Where are those placed throughout the field? Are those on a well by well basis, or are those kind of centralized in some sort of systemic fashion?
I'll let Mr. Wiley take this one. I think he's prepared.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, for the question. But yeah, I'll speak on that a little bit. So the H2S audio visual detection we do have in key locations near public receptors on several wells around the town of Rangeley. Both of our water plant facilities have H2S detection and our CO2 reinjection facility as well. Several of the collection stations also have that audio visual H2S detection. Really, to answer your question, key locations near and around town.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wiley. That's helpful. Yeah. Okay. So I appreciate that. And then wind indicators in your PowerPoint said every location, and then in the application itself it says strategically throughout the field. Tell me more about that.
Thank you. Yeah, wind indicators we do have in key areas of the field. We have wind indication at the facilities as well. We have the wind indicators. Our collection stations all have them, and it's kind of the same as the H2S audio visual. Key locations in and around town have wind indication.
Okay, that's helpful, Mr. Wiley. Again, thank you. And then I didn't see any contradiction in the materials here, but basically the fencing is around the collection station, but not at the wellheads.
We do have fencing around on the wells near the public receptors, within a quarter mile of the public receptors near the town of Rangeley.
Commissioner Gonzalez, if I could just add to that for clarification too.
Please, Ms. Fulcher.
Thank you very much. The BLM Onshore Order 6, which is part of your rules and is what is the PPP has been modeled after, also requires fencing at any location within a quarter mile of a public receptor. So to Mr. Wiley's point, any location, even if it's just a well location that comes within a quarter mile of a public receptor, so a building, unit, or a place where the public could be expected to be, Scout has fencing.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Fulcher, and thank you for the responses there.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think I'm going to just piggyback a little bit on Commissioner Gonzalez's question so I understand. When you say audio-visual monitoring, I guess in my head, I was expecting that to be people who see and smell or hear things. So it sounds to me like this is mechanical, and how does this mechanical thing see a gas? So is it like an LDAR, or I'm trying to understand how the audiovisual piece works as a protection at some of these locations.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner McGowan. I'll answer that question. So really, when I'm speaking of audiovisual H2S detection, it can come in both the fixed monitors, which we have at some of the facilities. So when I'm speaking of audio, we'll have an alarm will actually ring out. So whether that's the public or our personnel can hear an actual alarm. It does also broadcast over what we call our Scada system, which is the system we're using to monitor all of our process throughout the field. But you can hear it on location as well. The visual I'm speaking of is a beacon. So there's going to be generally in the gas plant, we'll have blue beacons we'll have yellow beacons for H2S, and on locations with the detection or at the facilities, there'll also be a beacon for that visual alarm. Dealing with our personal monitors, all the individual employees are required to wear the personal. They'll have both visual as far as red lights flashing and making noise as well. So hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. That's so much more clear to me. So if I'm understanding, you have fixed monitors at locations near potential receptors that are there 24/7. And if they detect something, then the audio visual alarms go off, and then your staff is able to respond.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. That was somehow just missing the mark for me. Okay. Could you explain to me, I think what you're also saying is that if there were to be a leak, that what's coming out of the wells is, I don't know what the right word is, a low enough amount that it would take a long time for it to hit a receptor, and therefore it's also a lower risk. Is that what I'm understanding? You'd be able to catch it before it wafted into town.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, really, we have assessed all of our wells, all of our facilities for a radius of exposure. So the way we're configuring that radius of exposure, there's an equation, Pascal-Gifford equation. It's really taking that H2S mole fraction, associating that with the volume of gas, and determining whether maybe that gas cloud or whatever, what have you, is going to meet that 50-foot, 100-foot radius of exposure. None of our wells or facilities fall into that, which is why we're not actually required to have the public protection plan. We're just doing that as an additional safeguard. So yeah, to answer the question, none of our facilities or wells fall in to be critical with that radius of exposure.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, I don't know if potentially, I think I saw that our staff supported the variance, but the director took no position. I think I saw that. And I'm wondering if staff is comfortable having this variance be in perpetuity, or if they would like some sort of a check-in, or if the PPP is enough to provide them assurance that there's going to be constant updating of anything that needs to get updating as far as safety is concerned.
Thanks, Commissioner McGowan. I think it is appropriate to ask staff what their position is on this. I don't think it was particularly clear in the materials we received. So I wonder if Mr. Berger or Mr. Leonard would be willing to share their thoughts about the PPP, the onshore order 6, and this particular variance request. Which one of you would like to start?
I'll let Mr. Berger go first.
Mr. Berger.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, commissioners. I guess I've been around on the western side of the state for a while here, and back in, I think it was 2017, we Chevron did come forward with a formal public protection plan. And obviously we had discussed things with them before that for quite a few years. I feel that public protection plan is adequate. Now, as far as any kind of updating, we had told Chevron that if their personnel changes, they need to at least update the contact informations in that public protection plan. And that's the way it stood since 2017, when the BLM and our staff met with them and agreed that, yeah, if things change with your people and contacts, we need an updated plan. So, Mike, you have anything to add or detract from that?
Sure, and the only other thing I would mention is if the levels at the plant dramatically increased, then I think, you know, there should be some investigation to see if one or more of the wells has changed. I doubt that will happen. It's a fairly stable environment right now. I think they all use some H2S controls, but being a water flood, it's tough to get rid of it once you have it. But they've got it stabilized.
Mr. Chair, could I offer a couple of other comments?
Sure.
Thank you very much. To Mr. Leonard's point, 612F4 does require that if concentrations were to increase by 25% at any of the gas sampling, that the operator is required to report that to the local governments, and I think to the director as well. So to Mr. Leonard's point, I think we would absolutely be comfortable with reporting that and making revisions if necessary if we were to see that jump pursuant to the rule. I don't think that Scout and Chevron are looking to change that aspect of the reporting if concentrations were to jump, just to say that the analysis is going to happen at the gas plant and not at 800 well locations. So basically we just echo and support Mr. Leonard's comment there. And with respect to the review, the PPP, if it wasn't clear, is required to be reviewed annually per the BLM onshore order 6. So that is a requirement under the PPP, and will actually be undergoing its review again this month. It happens in June of every year. And I think that Scout and Chevron are happy to provide just updates if there are any to staff each year when that happens.
Thank you, Ms. Fulcher. Thank you, Mr. Berger, Mr. Leonard. Commissioner McGowan, did you have questions that you wanted to ask staff? Or?
No, I might, if we get to, when we get to discussion, I might have some things I want to see if commissioners are open to, and or the operator, as I don't know if conditions of approval, but just kind of to add to what we're approving.
Sure. I've got a couple of questions. So my first question, and this will be for the applicant, is and or staff if they wish to share a little bit about this, but I think I need to better understand the PPP and what are the elements that are involved in the PPP that protect public health, and how that's compatible with this variance request and asking for relief from certain rules that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess we'll start it out, and then if staff wants to supplement anything I've stated or Ms. Blevins have stated, I think I'm going to ask Nicole if she would to just kind of walk through at a high level what a PPP is, and then specifically this one, and then if Mr. Wiley, Mr. Mercer want to add anything specific regarding this individual PPP as it applies to the Rangeley field, that makes sense if we can start there.
Sure, no problem, Jill. Thank you, Commissioner Messner, for the question. So onshore order 6 governs hydrogen sulfide oil and gas operations, and it applies, as we have mentioned, more broadly actually than COGCC's hydrogen sulfide rules, in that it applies to facilities in addition to wells. But of course, for purposes of our application today, we're seeking a variance under the COGCC rules. So we're pretty much focused on what's going to occur or not occur at the wells. But to kind of take a step back and understand what a PPP is, and it is a plan that's required under onshore order 6 for federal oil and gas operations when you have essentially certain public receptors within a certain radius of exposure of H2S. And so when you trigger, and those radii of exposure are very similar, they're essentially identical to COGCCs as you have in Rule 612. And so when you have public receptors within an H2S radius of exposure from one of your facilities under onshore order 6, you're required to implement a public protection plan. And onshore order 6 includes a number of safeguards, if you will, that are to be included in your public protection plan. And I think that's what you're asking about, and how does that protect the public, and how are we to ensure that this variance will be protective. So I also would just kind of note, before we get into the individual safeguards, the onshore order 6, just as COGCC rules, are looking at a risk, they're applying on a risk-based application. So again, if there are public receptors within the radius of exposure, then we're going to trigger these additional public protection requirements, essentially. So onshore order 6 and COGCC rules are parallel in terms of the radii of exposure trigger and how they would apply to H2S operations. So going beyond that, the public protection plan requires, as we have discussed, fencing of any H2S operations that are within a quarter mile of a public receptor. In addition, it requires signage, H2S warning signs, wind indicators, and a number of requirements for personnel protection. So in terms of, as it relates to wells, personnel that are going to be out at the wells are required to have H2S training. Certain individuals may be required to have respiratory protection, personal monitors for H2S, training, et cetera. So there's a broad array of requirements that are stemming from onshore order 6 that are required to be in the public protection plan, and in fact are in the public protection plan that we're discussing today. So it's everything that we've talked about. It's fencing, wind indicators, alarms, maps, training, personal protective equipment, calculating the radii of exposure, reviewing and updating your plan at least on an annual basis. I hope that answers your question. There's a lot, it's very dense in terms of its requirements, but I would be happy to answer any additional questions you have about that.
No, I appreciate that. And I ask these questions because essentially what you're asking for is to replace some of our rules with this personal protection plan to ensure the protection of public health, which is one of the bars that needs to be met in a variance request. So I'm trying to fully understand how that would be met. And I think I'm hearing, and I just want to confirm this, that Mr. Berger, Mr. Leonard, you as COGCC staff are comfortable with the personal protection plan as it is written, understanding that it needs to be updated annually, being protective of public health in this particular situation.
Commissioner, that's correct.
Yes, Commissioner. And I guess maybe, I think there was one thing that wasn't real clear in the presentation, but it was touched upon, I believe, by one of the mics there. Is it, they did mention that they have a Scada system that monitors all their wells. And that's why there was questions about, is there monitoring at the wells or not? Well, there is with the Scada system. And our understanding is that if something happens and things start coming out of the well, that well can be shut in remotely. Is that correct, Scout?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. That is correct. All of our production wells have, and I did touch on it, they have both low pressure and high pressure shutdowns. So they will shut down any kind of artificial lift tied to that well. It also sends an alarm to that Scada system, which Craig had said, which is manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So in the instance that we do have an alarm or maybe a possible loss of containment, we really do just get our resources going that way as soon as possible. The nice thing about Rangeley is nothing's very far away from anything. It can take you 10 minutes to get across the field, essentially, is what I'm saying. So thank you.
Yeah, so I consider that an additional level of protection that really isn't a requirement of the BLM onshore order number 6.
I think I heard in testimony that the PPP is a voluntary program that Chevron and now potentially Scout would be entering into or continuing to utilize. Understanding that it's voluntary, but also understanding that we're essentially saying that the PPP is the tool that is to be utilized to develop the protection of public health. Would the applicant be open to not having it as a voluntary element, but a requirement for approval of this variance, that the PPP be in place and be updated annually?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we would. And as you know, we have been and are operating as if the PPP is in place and will be in place for, the entirety of the unit.
Okay. I appreciate that. I have just one other question, and just to make sure I fully understand the different facilities and the different stages in which the monitoring may occur. But I wonder, Ms. Fulcher, if you would put up that slide that had the arrows and the boxes talking about the different facilities. And I just didn't understand at which point we were testing for H2S in that kind of flow chart that you had put together. So it's just helping me better understand the full picture of things.
Commissioner Messner, can you see my screen? It should say variance application here.
I cannot.
Oh, okay. Let me try here. All right, how about now?
Now I can.
All right, let me scroll over to the slide that you're requesting. Here we go. And I think Mike Wiley, you want to start this taking on this question, and if we need to kick it to Mike Mercer.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ms. Fulcher. So yeah, thanks for the question and wanting the clarity. So as you can see from the producing wells, all the fluids, both water, oil, and gas, are directed to the collection stations. I'll just start at the beginning, right? So from that collection station, we're separating the fluids, which is the oil and water. It's going to the water plants. The CO2 is getting directed to the gas plant. So when that gas, which is coming from all of the producing wells throughout the unit, gets to the gas plant, we're sampling it 8 different times on a monthly basis within that facility. And from that,
at the CO2 plant compression in this particular diagram, this is where that testing is occurring.
Correct. That is correct. Yep.
That's where I was a little confused. I wasn't sure if it was being tested at the collection stations or at the CO2 plant compression area.
Yeah, so all of the CO2 is coming to that facility and then is getting redistributed throughout the field from there. So it's really the commingling spot of that gas for the entire unit is coming through that plant.
Okay. I appreciate that explanation. That was helpful for me. I don't have any further questions. Commissioners, does anyone else have questions before we move on to deliberations? Seeing no further questions, appreciate the presentation and taking the time to answer our questions. So I'll open it up to commissioners. to start a deliberation discussion? Who wants to start? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just thinking out loud here, so maybe y'all can help me kind of process. So in regards to the variance from signage, it sounds to me like the PPP requires signage also. And I think what Commissioner Gonzalez was saying is we still want to see signage at each of the wells, letting folks know of the potential exposure that might happen. So the variance is really a variance from the distance to each well. You're not asking for a variance from placing signage at each location. Am I on the right track here? Okay, and so how can we make sure that that is reflected in what you're asking for? That our expectation is that there will still be signage at each location, even though it might be at different distances than where they normally might be. Does that make sense? And is that covered in the PPP?
It is covered in the PPP. So, one way to approach it, and I think kind of as what we were proposing, is to allow operations to continue pursuant to the PPP, which does include the signage requirement.
Okay. So then I think also wanting to ensure, to staff's point, if anything were to change significantly in the PPP, and I don't know if significantly is the right word, or if the PPP were to no longer exist, and maybe to Commissioner Mesner's point is, if the PPP no longer exists and the operator's not following it, something has to come back to the commission so we make sure that we're covering all of our bases, and the variance, all the requirements we have in our rules don't have a variance anymore. And are you open to some sort of language that reflects what we're trying to get at there? Or are we taking care of that already in this request? I'm just thinking out loud, so.
Yeah, Commissioner McGowan, if I may, I think the operators, Scout, Chevron, are comfortable with the PPP being a requirement or a condition of approval on the variance. So if the PPP were no longer in place, or if upon staff's review of that document, which is going to be provided to them annually at your direction, if staff had concerns, I think that would potentially trigger this coming back to you. And certainly if the PPP were done away with, I think that the variance at that point would no longer be in effect, and Scout would have to come back to this commission for further relief if necessary. What's also included in our application is that this variance would be tied to the unit operations. So if at any point this unit contracts, and it is a federal secondary recovery unit, if it were to contract, then the variance would only apply to the unit lands. Whatever is no longer in the unit would then be subject to your rule 612E 1-4 and 612F4. So I think that there are a few safeguards in place with the way the application is drafted, and then also with mandating the PPP that would immediately kind of remove the variance, if you will, if those things weren't followed.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then what are your thoughts on how we might be able to cover an increase in production of 25% or more, also requiring coming back to the commission and staff just to make sure that we're comfortable with what's in the PPP, or having a variance?
I think, again, thank you, Commissioner, for the question. And I think, again, just approving the application will still require Scout to come back to the commission and to report to local governments if the gas stream concentrations of H2S were to increase by 25%, because we're asking that the CO2 plant be the testing point for the monthly gas testing, but we're not asking for anything, any other variances to that testing requirement. So 612F4, as it's written, requires monthly gas testing. We're still going to do that. And it requires reporting of increased gas concentrations at 25% or greater. We're still going to do that. The only issue is we're not going to do it at each and every well location, but instead just at the CO2 plant. So if you approve the application, you're saying that the CO2 plant is going to serve as the proxy location for all of the 800 wells in the field. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, I think just approving the application and the requested relief is still going to require the operator to report to you if the gas concentrations substantially increase.
Okay, thank you for walking me through that.
Sure.
So I think, depending on what my fellow commissioners think, I'm supportive of Commissioner Mesner's idea of requiring the PPP, and if the PPP somehow changes significantly or is no longer in effect, we need to come back to the commission.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
I would support that idea.
I would as well. I think that makes sense. I think that hearing from staff and understanding that the PPP, as it is written and understanding that it is updated annually, does develop a set of tools for this particular site-specific location that is effective and protective. But I do think that, requiring that is an important piece. And to, Commissioner McGowan's point, I think that, increasing concentrations of H2S at the CO2 plant, I think inherently triggers a review by the commission through other rules that aren't being asked for variances from. And so I think that's covered. And it does sound like the requirements for fencing and for signage and for testing, are covered in that PPP. So I would be comfortable with that. So with that, I would entertain a motion. And we can ask AAG Davenport to suggest a motion if folks are uncomfortable with developing one or modifying it once a motion occurs.
So with AAG Davenport's approval, I guess I would move to approve the variance request with the condition that the PPP is required. And should it no longer be in use or used by the operator, they have to come back to the commission. And I'm
Second.
sure that that's not an elegant way to say that. So I'm sure AAG Davenport is going to help me here.
AAG Davenport.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner McGowan, that is, I think, sufficient for the purposes of drafting the written order that will come out of this hearing.
And I would add that just a small caveat that it needs to be updated annually and provided to the COGCC staff. But with that, we have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on this topic? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Hi.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you all for presenting to us today.
Thank you very much.
I think with that, we will take our break. So it is 10:24 right now. Let's do a 15-minute break and come back at 10:40. Okay, we will continue with today's hearing, starting now with docket number 2204-00076, Carbon Storage Solutions, represented by Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs, is your team here?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I believe so. John Jacobs with Davis, Graham and Stubbs for Carbon Storage Solutions, a wholly owned subsidiary of Front Range Energy. Shall I make introductions of our team?
Yeah, go ahead. We'll do same process as the last variance request, which is applicant presentation, and then questions from commissioners to the applicant and to relevant staff following. So
Thank you.
go ahead, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you so much. Again, John Jacobs, representing Carbon Storage Solutions. With us today for this application are my colleague, Andrea Bronson, will be leading our presentation shortly, as well as our associate, Kelsey Johnson. Here for Carbon Storage Solutions is President Dan Sanders. Is Mr. Sanders elevated, or can we get him elevated? He'll be testifying, as well as Stephen Miller with Summit Companies on the CSS team.
I think we've got Mr. Sanders now. And there's
Thank you. Dan Sanders, Vice President of Front Range Energy and President of its wholly owned subsidiary Carbon Storage Solutions, the applicant. Also with us now is Stephen Miller with the Summit Companies on the CSS team for this project.
Good morning.
Turn it over now to Ms. Bronson, who will be screen sharing. Thank you.
Did that work? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So, good morning, commissioners. My name is Andrea Bronson, representing Carbon Storage Solutions in this matter. We are here today because CSS requests a variance for its proposed stratigraphic test well from all requirements of Rule 303 pertaining to oil and gas development plans. CSS's parent company, Front Range Energy, operates an ethanol manufacturing plant. CSS plans to locate and drill a stratigraphic test well on Front Range's property to evaluate the suitability of deep formations for injection and sequestration of all CO2 from the ethanol manufacturing process. Commission Rule 303A requires CSS to submit an oil and gas development plan and a location assessment prior to commencing operations for the test well. CSS cannot submit an application to drill until it receives commission approval of an OGDP. In this application, CSS requests a variance from the OGDP requirements of Rule 303. Mr. Sanders will testify first to provide an overview of the project and the need for the variance. Mr. Miller will then testify regarding the engineering design for the well and the steps CSS will take to avoid adverse impacts. To start, however, these first two slides summarize the basis of CSS's variance request and how it meets all requirements of Rule 502C. First, CSS is unable to comply with specific requirements contained in Rule 303, which are premised on the assumption that an operator is engaging in oil and gas development, such that any wells it drills will ultimately result in the exploration or production of oil and gas. Because of this non-congruence of the test well into the Rule 303 requirements, it is impossible for CSS to analyze oil and gas impacts to air, water, and public health since there will be no oil and gas exploration. Second, the requested variance will not violate the basic intent of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. There will be no oil and gas storage, oil and gas equipment, including tanks or separators. There will be no ongoing emissions for oil and gas production. Most of the Rule 303 requirements are irrelevant in the situation, and thus undertaking them will not lead to protection of public health, safety, and welfare. Instead, CSS's ultimate goal of creating a carbon capture and sequestration well has the potential to reduce carbon emissions, which will benefit and promote the intent of the Act. Third, the requested variance is necessary to avoid an undue hardship. Without the variance, CSS will be required to undertake the inapplicable and time-consuming requirements of the OGDP, which will significantly delay CSS's plan to analyze the suitability of the relevant formation for carbon sequestration via the test well, and its ability to commence the EPA's Class 6 permitting process, and in turn delay Front Range's ability to sequester the CO2 from its ethanol manufacturing operations. Granting the variance will result in no net adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources. The test well will not produce hydrocarbons, nor have the impacts that oil and gas wells typically have. Additional discussion of why granting the variance will not result in net adverse impacts will be discussed in Stephen Miller's testimony. Fifth and finally, no conditions of approval or other mitigation measures are necessary to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts to public health, safety, the environment, and wildlife resources. We'll now turn it over to Dan Sanders.
Thank you, Andrea, and good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. My name is Dan Sanders. I'm the President of Carbon Storage Solutions and the Vice President of Front Range Energy. Front Range Energy manufactures fuel ethanol and other co-products at our manufacturing plant in Windsor, Colorado. CSS was formed as a wholly owned subsidiary of Front Range Energy to pursue a carbon capture project at our facility to drive our process of fermenting corn to make fuel ethanol and other co-products towards an overall carbon negative impact. To further Front Range's efforts of sequestering CO2, CSS plans to drill the proposed test well on Front Range's property to obtain geological samples, which will then be used to evaluate the suitability of deep formations for injection and sequestration of CO2. Specifically, we will determine if the test well may be suitable for use and be re-permitted with EPA as a Class 6 underground injection control well to permanently sequester CO2 produced from our Front Range Energy's fuel ethanol production process. CSS has received approval from the owner of the underlying mineral estate, a majority of the surface owners of the anticipated pore space plume area in the town of Windsor for the current proposed location of the test well. Sequestration of CO2 is currently regulated by EPA, and the EPA is supportive of this project. However, the COGCC regulates stratigraphic test wells drilled to gather information necessary for geological evaluation of proposed Class 6 UIC wells. Therefore, we are respectfully requesting a variance from the Oil and Gas Development Plan requirements of Rule 303, including submission of a Form 2B and Form 2C. CSS will never drill or produce oil or gas from this test well. Thus, the requirements of Rule 303 do not apply, and it's not possible for CSS to comply with them. The substantive review process for the test well will be the same if COGCC grants the variance, because it's simply waiver requirements that have no bearing on this project. The variance will not result in any adverse impacts to public health and safety, the environment, or wildlife resources, and instead will help CSS's project to combat climate change and start with this development in a reasonable regulatory framework. Thank you.
Oh, Mr. Miller will testify next. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Stephen Miller, and I'm the Operations Manager at Summit Companies. Carbon Storage Solutions hired our company to assist them with engineering, permitting, and drilling of their stratigraphic test well. The proposed test well will be drilled on an industrial park parcel owned by Front Range Energy and is located more than 1.25 miles from the nearest residential community. It is not within a high priority habitat, and although there are 3 designated high priority habitats within 1 mile of the proposed test well. However, adverse indirect impacts to these habitats is not expected due to CSS's commitments to sound spill prevention, control and countermeasure best management practices, and stormwater best management practices. Additionally, this test well will never produce oil or gas, which will avoid the potential for impacts usually associated with the production from an oil and gas well, such as truck traffic and workover rigs. Approximately 200 feet west of the test well, there is 1 dry ditch categorized in the National Hydrography Dataset and National Wetland Inventory. But on top of CSS's stormwater BMPs and spill prevention BMPs, the ground surface surrounding the test well is graded to drain stormwater runoff away from the ditch, and the existing train tracks also serve as additional barrier. Therefore, in the unlikely event of a spill during drilling activities, there will be no impact to the NHD NWI feature. To drill this test well, CSS will use a mobile drilling rig operating under all COGCC, CDPHE, and relevant federal requirements. Drilling and casing operations will take approximately 2 weeks to complete and use state-of-the-art technology. CSS has designated the test well to avoid any adverse impacts from drilling. First, CSS will set surface casing past the base of the Fox Hill to cover all freshwater zones. Next, they will set intermediate casing down to the lichens formation to cover all zones that could be considered aquifers or oil and gas bearing formations. Third, CSS will set production casing to the total depth of the test well. All casing strings will be cemented to surface to prevent fluid movement behind the casing and provide zonal isolation. CSS has high-graded its casing and cement plans to account for any stresses, fluids, or gases throughout the life of the well. Finally, CSS will evaluate all aspects of the well required by Rule 308 in its Form 2. CSS plans to implement numerous minimization measures to eliminate impacts and protect public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources. To protect air quality, CSS will employ practices for continuous control of fugitive dust caused by operations, including restricting the speed during construction on leased roads and locations to 10 miles an hour if dust is visible, 20 miles per hour if dust is not visible, restricting speed during all other operational phases to 10 miles per hour, grading and recompacting the road whenever the road surface becomes deteriorated or monthly if heavy traffic is present, restricting construction during high wind days or when dust becomes fugitive. Further, there will be no emissions producing reserve pits as CSS is committed to closed loop drilling. For protection of wildlife or water resources, CSS will implement a site-specific stormwater management plan to protect the waters of the state that could receive stormwater runoff from the test well. There will not be any permanent staging, refueling, or chemical storage areas associated with the project within 500 feet of any water resources. CSS will also manage potential pollutants by sealing, wrapping, covering, and or containing chemicals or other materials while not actively being used to prevent discharges from the site. Proper storage, safe handling, good housekeeping, and spill prevention practices will be implemented to prevent pollutants or contaminants from leaving the site. Finally, energy dissipators such as coconut blankets, straw mulch, or straw wattles will be installed during construction and will be left in place and maintained for the life of the project or until disturbed slopes have been stabilized. To protect surrounding wildlife, employees and contractors will be educated on proper wildlife conservation practices. CSS will also implement fugitive dust control measures, post speed limits and caution signs to the extent allowed, and reduce traffic by storing water needed for drilling on location. To reduce impacts to the soil, CSS will implement site-specific topsoil management and stormwater management plans. Cut and fill areas awaiting reclamation will be graded to match pre-existing contours in order to provide long-term erosion control and site stability. Topsoil stockpile will be graded to ensure safe and effective surface stabilization, and CSS will use rig matting to protect soil from potential spills. CSS plans to protect the surrounding vegetation by confirming erosion and sedimentation controls are implemented as necessary before and after seeding operations, and then monitor and maintain the vegetation on the topsoil stockpiles to promote native vegetation and suppress noxious weeds. To minimize the possibility of fires during the construction phase, equipment including welding trucks will be equipped with fire extinguishers and spark arresters. Vehicles must be driven at low speeds and remain on existing roads and permitted facility locations at all times. CSS will also implement a transportation plan to guide the management of transportation during the drilling and completion phase. Regarding the surrounding air quality, CSS will ensure all operations comply with all relevant air quality control regulations. CSS will use freshwater mud system for surface holes, a Group 2 oil-based mud for drilling, and catch can systems to catch mud in order to prevent spills and odors. CSS will minimize light pollution by using LED fixtures, reduce lighting to minimal levels for safe activity, and using lighting sensors to direct lighting towards drilling tasks only. On top of those minimization measures, CSS plans to mitigate the severity of possible impacts by recontouring and revegetating roads and pads to a stable condition in order to restore the natural habitats for wildlife. They will place signs on each topsoil stockpile to preserve the material for reclamation and reseed disturbed areas and monitor revegetation. They will also implement a weed control plan through the employment of a third-party consultant. In addition to these salient effects of the above listed measures, CSS will be able to ensure the test well will not cause net adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources through the evaluation of the proposed locations CSS test well via Form 2As, its associated resource-specific plans, and the design of the well through the Form 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. In conclusion, CSS requests that the Commission grant CSS's proposed variance and exempt the test well, including the associated, exempt the test well from all Rule 303 requirements, including the associated Form 2A, Form 2, and authorize the Director to process and approve the Form 2A and Form 2 associated with the test well without an approved OGDP. We are happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you all for the presentation. Commissioners, are there questions for the applicant? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. And this is something a little new for the commission to discuss. And I think where I'm getting wrapped around the axle, and maybe you can walk me through what this process is going to look like. Are you asking for also a variance from the Form 2 and 2A, or will that be submitted and get approved by the commission as if it were an OGDP, but then it doesn't have the accompanying 2B and 2C? I think I'm struggling. Something has to get approved, like what kind of equipment you're going to use, what the disturbance looks like. A lot of the testimony that you submitted already looks like what would be submitted as part of a Form 2A. And so can you just walk me through what is the process going to look like if we grant you what you're asking for?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, you are correct. A Form 2A and a Form 2 will be submitted for staff review and approval. So we are only seeking a variance from the OGDP requirements in Rule 303, including the Form 2B and 2C.
Thank you. And then after staff review, does that go to the commission for approval as part of its normal process, or are we saying staff is just going to approve it?
My understanding, and Mr. Jacobs, feel free to jump in as well, is that it'll go through the staff review process, but the staff cannot review the Form 2A normally without an OGDP. And since we are requesting a variance from that, they wouldn't be able to do the completeness, to even review it after completeness without the variance.
That is correct. If I may, staff has indicated that's why this application for variance precedes the submission of our 2A, is that the 2A would be deemed incomplete if we didn't already have a variance from the 303 requirements we're seeking today.
Yes, thank you. I understand that, and maybe I'm just not being clear. So after we grant this variance, you do your Form 2A, it goes through staff for completeness, and then it just comes back to the commission through its normal process and we approve.
That is
okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bogue.
Thanks for the presentation. I'd be interested in hearing more about what you know about the geologic suitability of the area for underground storage and how you know that.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner. I can try to address that for you. So we have engaged a geological team from University of Wyoming. We have also purchased the available underground charting that's available in the area from the extensive oil and gas operations within our industrial park. And so it gives an example of what's below us geologically. You know, unfortunately for us, we have to drill this test well because there's not been too many wells drilled ever in this area that go down to these as deep as we're going in this formation. So we are targeting formations that are below 8,000 feet, 8,000 and below. Currently right now, we're looking at the Entrada and the Lions formations as potential targets for our project. We have to confirm that with this test well, obviously, but the available data that we have that our experts have looked at indicates that the area is strong indication of saline aquifers that are, palatable for injection of our quantities of CO2.
Thank you.
Other commissioner questions? I've got a couple. Help me understand, and to Commissioner Bogue's question, I mean, I think you answered it a little bit, but I understand that the goal of this is not to develop hydrocarbons. At the same time, when you drill a well into certain formations, hydrocarbons could be present. Water could be present that has hydrocarbons associated with. I mean, what kind of, what could be coming out of this well when you drill it, and how will that be addressed?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. That's correct. Yeah, we could find hydrocarbons, we could find water down there. The Class 6 well itself is specific to protect U.S. drinking water. So if we find that in this pore space, then we cannot continue with this well as a Class 6 injection well. So we would cease operations and further evaluate other pore spaces in the area. Does that answer your question?
Partially. I mean, and so I assume that you'll have facilities or equipment available to address whatever comes out of the well as a test well, and the hydrocarbons that come out, assuming that we're not just venting these hydrocarbons that could be coming out of this particular test well should you hit those hydrocarbons. I mean, I'm asking technical questions, and I ask these to staff too, because I don't know, right? I don't know how a test well for carbon storage works and what potentially comes out of that, and just making sure that I understand what we're approving here.
Mr. Chairman, if I may direct your question to Mr. Miller, I think. Please, Stephen, if you jump in.
Yes, it's our plan that during the drilling process, we will encounter oil and gas bearing formations. We plan to drill right through them, and they will be handled as normal, as you normally would during drilling operations. Once we cement the casing in place, there is no plan to produce any fluids from this well. All of the testing process involves passive testing and seismic activity testing. And there may be small injection testings. We're talking on the order of less than 1 or 2 barrels worth, but there's no plan to actually flow any material back from the well itself. Does that answer your questions?
And should you run into gas hydrocarbons, how would that be addressed?
Those would be addressed the same way you address any normal drilling process, through the normal through the flaring or combustion of the gases as you're drilling, and we will not be hydraulically fracturing, so the contact with the formations will be minimal. Just the diameter of the drill bit as you're going through.
If I might add, Mr. Chairman, since they're not hydraulically fracturing, they will have equipment on site to handle any material that comes out, but it won't be on the order of, say, like a green completions type of equipment where you've got a large volume of flow back coming back, and then you transition from a flow back to a green completions and gas recovery type of operation using a heavy duty separator and that type of equipment. So because there won't be these volumes of flow back because they're not hydraulically fracturing at all, we don't anticipate the need or the volumes of material that would normally be associated with an unconventional oil and gas well.
Okay. And to Commissioner McGowan's question, I'll dive into it just a little bit deeper, but I understand that you're asking for a variance from the rules associated with 303, that 303 is the requirements for the development of OGDP, includes cumulative impacts report, includes a public hearing, includes notice to different local governments and adjoining residents, and so on and so forth. you're not asking for a variance from staff review and modification of Form 2As or Form 2s. And I assume that you're not asking for a variance of final commission decision and review of both the Form 2A and the Form 2 after staff has an opportunity to review those and provide a director's recommendation on those. Is that my understanding? So essentially you're asking for some of the hearing process variance and a variance from the Form 2B, 2C, but not the 2A and the Form 2s. And we would still have a hearing process associated with the Form 2As and the Form 2s. Is that my understanding? Or are you asking for an exemption from all of that and have this as a director approval?
We're asking for the exemption from the Form 2B and 2C in the OGDP under Rule 303, and that the Form 2 and the Form 2A would undergo the normal process, but for the need for the completeness review, including the OGDP.
And I wonder if I could ask staff just to generally provide their thoughts on this particular variance request. Mr. Schwartz, is that you?
Yes. Good
Okay.
morning, commissioners.
Go ahead.
So in terms of staff thoughts on this variance request, we would address any potential surface impacts of this Stratwell project through our review of the Form 2A when it comes in terms of reviewing the 2A for completeness. Once complete, it will undergo public comment, and then the technical review.
And so that aspect of it has not changed. So it would have public comment during the technical review process. It would be public comment once a director's recommendation came out to the commission and a decision was rendered at the commission level. Is that correct?
Correct. And we would also write the director recommendation and would go to hearing as well.
Okay. And because this is a test well for carbon storage, the real concern is around the need to do a 2B, 2C in an OGDP. Is that basically my understanding here? Is that your understanding, Mr. Schwartz?
That is my understanding of the review of the variance request.
Okay. Commissioners, do you have any further questions? I don't see any further questions, so thank you to the presenters and to staff for being present and sharing with us the variance request. At this stage, we'll move on to Commissioner deliberations. Is there anyone that wants to start with their thoughts? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This request made sense to me just because it is kind of a unique animal, and some of the things that we're requiring don't seem to fit. And I'm comfortable with the request, understanding that the Form 2 and 2A still goes through the normal process, staff assessment and completeness review, and then in front of the commission for approval, with the opportunity also for public comment. So I think this request makes sense.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I have no issues with this request. I would go forward as to put forth a motion to approve the variance as to the requirements under our commission rules for the Forms 2B and 2C under the OGDP process.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? With that, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you, commissioners.
So commissioners, I don't see anything else on our agenda unless I'm missing something. Ms. Larson.
You're not, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I think the next item of business is to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? We are adjourned. Enjoy the week. Thank you.